This is Learning Science Unpacked, a podcast mini-series from Sponge, dedicated to unpacking the science behind how we learn and behave. Over the next few sessions, I'll be digging deep into the science of learning with Professor Paul Howard-Jones, an educational neuroscientist at Bristol University. Together, we'll uncover the most effective strategies workplace learning professionals can use to optimise learning for performance, something we do at Sponge every day. Well, hi, Paul. Welcome back.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay, thank you. Yes, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks, and really appreciate you being here again to answer some questions on the science of learning, and really looking forward to this one today because I'm hoping that you've received something in the post from me.
Yes.
Look at that.
I have them here.
Great, brilliant. Well, what it is that today I thought we could answer some questions.
Open them.
You can open it, yeah, go for it.
No, I don't get much, snail mail. It's quite exciting.
Well, I hope so. Yes, do open that envelope, and what's inside is a selection of questions from our team at Sponge. So I thought we'd get them involved, and you've got some questions inside, have you?
I have. I can see them. Yes, I've got a whole pack of them here.
Fantastic. Right. Well, let's see what we.
Quite a few.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, let's see what we can achieve in the time. All right. What have you got for the first question?
So the first one is, how can we better support learning in the flow of work with performance support?
Okay. So I think this probably comes from a learning design technique that we use to not only give people a kind of initial piece of learning, but also to provide resources for them while they're back in work and on the job. And that might be, for example, if you were going to be operating some machinery for the first time, you might have a poster or some sort of augmentation that gives you some instruction on the operating procedure of that. Or it could be something, for example, if you're on a sales call, a customer service call, and you might have a script. These are sorts of props that we might use. But is that good for learning? And what can you tell us about whether, from a neuroscience point of view, these things are useful for developing knowledge?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the word prop, and I suppose you were thinking of it in sort of theatrical sense. But I mean, in a way, it's also appropriate because this is scaffolding, and it's generally of two types. So, in the first instance, this is all about information that you are learning or you have learned, but you have not yet consolidated. So you have representations of it in your brain, but they're more difficult to access. They're more difficult to make them useful in a way. And also, if you're not rehearsing them, actually you can lose them. So there is this sort of temporary state, let's say. So it's really good to be rehearsing them. And that's why you need to take your learning to the workplace and be using it. But what do you do in the spur of the moment when you actually need to have this information at your fingertips, and it can take longer to recall it? So having prompts there that help you find that information in your brain is really helpful. So this is the first type of scaffolding that this is achieving, is actually making the stuff that you've got in your long-term memory more accessible by just prompting its recall. If you were left with 30 seconds, you could probably remember it, but you haven't got 30 seconds. You're in the workplace. You need it now. And it's important that you are applying it in that context. So that's the first thing that is achieved by having something there that you can quickly refer to that prompts you to be able to recall this information when you need it. And of course, with time, because you are applying it in different situations, you will build up multiple representations of this information in your head. And that means that it's going to become more accessible to you, and it's going to be more automatically available. So you're not going to need the prompts after a while. And that the scaffolding, the prop, if you like, can be done away with. But, you'll know people don't tend to use these things unless they have to, because it's a pain having to refer to something. It's much easier for you if it's in your head. So it will fall away naturally like that. And then one day you'll just realize you haven't looked at it. But the other thing is that in the first instance, when you're applying this new information, and it may even be a new context, a new sort of job that you're doing. I mean, that's why you've received a training, let's say. So there's a lot of other stuff going on. Um, you're thinking your way through procedures that you have been taught, and you're checking yourself, you're monitoring what you're doing, you're trying to remember the things that you did incorrectly last time. You're probably hanging on to some information which might not be wholly relevant to this particular situation. Um, and and all of that is occupying your working memory. So it means that you're not able to pay as much conscious attention as you would like to the job in hand. So that's the other type of scaffolding that's going on. It's actually allowing. It means that some of the information that you need to do this job is actually represented outside of your brain. So it means you've got more working memory capacity to be able to process what you're doing. And again, when you've processed it enough times, it will become automatic. And then, of course, not only will it become more accessible and usable, but also there'll be less load on your working memory. So the role of these resources as a working memory prop or a working memory scaffold will also no longer be necessary, and it will just fall away.
So you definitely would recommend then, if people are learning new information, that having certain props or scaffolds or materials available to them can be helpful in maybe the accuracy of the work that they're going to be carrying out until it becomes automatic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's really important that in these first instances that you are applying the procedures or whatever you've learned, the content correctly, because if you're not doing that, it's not a very good idea to be practicing something that's like half correct and then thinking, oh, later on I'll get it 100% correct. It's better to be rehearsing it and practicing it 100% correct from the outset with your scaffolding, with your resources, because otherwise you're going to set up these habits which then become quite difficult to break.
Well, I think that really answers the first question. Shall we move on to the second one?
Absolutely. What is the impact of visual design on the effectiveness of learning? I mean, this is an interesting one. I mean, visuals are really important. I mean, the first thing at a very low level, the visuals will affect your attention. By a low level, we use that phrase to mean something which is automatic, that you're not even in control of. So as soon as the page appears, the visuals will direct your attention to particular parts of it. And, I mean, scientists have even been able to draw maps of a website page and shown where, based on the visual features of the website, your attention is likely to be focused initially. So, and there's all sorts of things that contribute to that. The color, the text, the density, familiarity, all those sorts of aspects are likely to influence that part of your learning. But learning, attention is the gateway to learning. So that's a really important thing that happens straight away. I mean, the other thing, once you've started paying attention to what's on the page, then the next thing is that you need to start learning, and you may be reading text or you may be looking at a visual image, and both of those can be communicating information. But the really effective thing in terms of your learning is when you're being encouraged and supported in making links between what is being represented visually and the text. So, that's an important point to make as well. And then, of course, you also have to worry about extraneous visual information. So that's one of the reasons why sometimes representations, abstract, symbolic sort of representations of something can be more effective than a photograph, say, because there can be an awful lot of extraneous information in a photograph. Whereas when you're producing a cartoon image of something, you're really bringing out the features that you want the learner to think about in that situation. So, yeah, I mean, you have to think about attention and the way that it's focusing the learner to look at particular things. And you have to think about not introducing extraneous information into that very limited working memory space. But the other thing in terms of learning is making the links between the visual representation and the other pieces of information that are represented in other ways on the page.
Now, is that related to distractions? Can we ever go wrong here with visuals on the page? What would be considered kind of bad practice?
Well, I think sometimes you can have too many, bells and whistles, and this is very difficult because we're talking about engagement as well. Engagement is really important, and the visuals can add a lot to engaging you through representing something in a novel way, through simplifying messages. But then, of course, it can go the other way, and very rich environments can actually be distracting if the information that is contributing to that richness of the environment is not really relevant to the learning. And this is one of the difficult things I think that educators are beginning to struggle with now, is that we're realizing that some of the things that we really enjoy doing, like putting wonderful displays on walls or encouraging readers with beautifully illustrated text, are not always the most effective ways of actually transmitting, communicating, teaching the message.
So would your recommendation be then to make sure that the visual artifacts on the page are sort of balanced with the whole overall picture is balanced? We're conscious that we're pointing people's attention immediately, subconsciously, to a place on the page and being aware of that. And then secondarily, it would be good for us to make sure, of course, that the visual information supports the kind of message connection between any written content and visual content. So it's building other representations. And then finally, not getting carried away with the aesthetics to the point where it's beyond engaging and actually distracting and doesn't help encourage the learning.
Yeah, and it depends where you are in the learning process as well. I mean, there'll be times when you just want to get people interested in a particular topic, and that initially, maybe a very rich visual environment to just draw them in, particularly if it's not a very interesting topic, can be really important. But when it gets to the point where you're really putting over the messages, that's when you really need to think about the learning first and think about, what the messages are and what's the best way of getting them across, and how making links between the visuals and the text is going to actually support the learning.
Is there anything about emotion? Because I always think that the visuals, more than just looking at words, create a feeling in us. Does that help in any way?
Well, yeah, because when I talk about engagement, if we're talking about it in terms of the brain, and this is one of the nice things about involving the brain when we're thinking about how we learn, is it is actually an emotional experience. So scientists, we've talked about the way in which the reward system activates and produces this approach motivation in us to make us want to go forward towards a learning experience. But you'll find that in a neuroscience book, you'll find that under E for emotions. There's a chapter on emotions. That's where they put it in, because this is an emotional experience. And yeah, things. If you're trying to remember something, then if there are emotions that are produced by it, then that will make it more memorable. This is emotional learning, and that's one of the reasons for that is because the hippocampus, which is so important for laying down the memory, and the amygdala, which is very important emotional center, those are right next to each other in the brain to enable this emotional tagging of memories and to enable them to be more memorable. So, yeah, I think we should always be thinking about emotions when we're talking about learning.
All right. Well, that's been a really good description of the value of visuals. Let's move on to the next question in your envelope. What is it?
What does attention span for learning look like? How long can we be expected to absorb information in a video or e-learning? I see. I just sort of, I like this question. Okay, but I always have this issue with the word absorb. I just think that's not a good way to think about learning, really, because actually learning does have to be active. So if you just plop people into a very rich environment that might be very rich visually, or even just in terms of text, or both together, it doesn't necessarily mean that them sitting there in that rich environment, they're going to learn anything by osmosis or by absorption. They actually have to actively process the information in order for you to understand it and remember it. So anyway, but I'll leave that aside. What does attention span look like for learning? Look like, in other words, I imagine that the idea is how long can it be?
Yeah, and quite often we're asked, to recommend to clients how long an experience might be, generally speaking, based on the amount of content that there is to cover, rather than, say, the amount of actions that people need to practice. But it's a common thing in our industry. So, we can make more money if things take longer to build, but actually we know that that's not good for learning, and we're always trying to optimise the minimum amount of time, I guess, for learning to occur, but for it to be effective. So I suppose the question really is about attention and how long people can hold their attention for in order to gain access to new knowledge and information.
Okay, so I mean, if you all over the country at the moment, there are teenagers sitting on video games, be it Call of Duty or Minecraft, and they are learning in the sense that they will remember a lot of what happened in that game because they are very, very engaged in it, and they will be able to play that game for hours, and they are caught in what some people term a flow experience. And a lot of, so what I'm saying is, in that instance, actually people are learning for hours without having any sort of break, if you like. Now, I understand that that's not the learning that we're talking about, but I mention it just because I think the idea that we have a sort of fixed attention span for learning is not terribly helpful. That's not really how learning works. Although I do understand that what we need to find ways of making learning as efficient as possible. But it really depends on a lot of these emotional factors. Actually, we're talking about emotions, but how engaged people are. I mean, during a video game, you will see the brain's reward system pumping away, and actually having very similar effects in terms of midbrain dopamine release as taking methylphenidate or Ritalin. It's really powerful. So, can we make a learning experience like that? Because then you've got effectively an infinite attention span. And I suppose in a way that is something to aspire to. I'm not saying we want to turn all our learning into video games, but interesting. No, I'm not saying that, but that's the end, right at the end of the scale, really, in terms of how we would like people to be engaged in their learning, and then you've got a very long attention span. Now, you can't always do that because not all content lends itself to being able to put in a video game or anything like that. So we need to think about other ways of doing it, and actually another phenomenon that sort of knocks against this idea of an attention span is spaced learning, because what you can do there is actually cut up your learning experience into short segments where there are breaks in between, sort of 10, 15 minutes of the segments with breaks. And you might think, well, hang on, that's really making things inefficient because we're now just adding all these breaks and we're extending. But we find that has a really beneficial effect upon the learning that's achieved. And in fact, you can learn more efficiently like that than you can if you just mass all the components of learning together. And then there's interleaving, where you're saying, okay, we've got two things we want to learn, and rather than having a 1 hour session on one and a 1 hour session on the other, actually interleave them. So you're breaking them up into different, do one for 15 minutes and you do the other for 15 minutes. So the whole idea of an attention span becomes quite a fluid sort of concept in that sense. And really what we should be thinking about is, okay, how do we maximize engagement? How do we make sure that people are not getting distracted? How can we make sure that people are processing the information and applying the information so that they're learning at the fastest possible rate?
And pacing it well
Pacing,
over time.
pace is an interesting question. Yeah, and that's an interesting phrase, pacing, because people will say, when you talk about pacing, people often think in terms of have I managed to have I managed to present the information as fast as I possibly could have done? And actually, the appropriate pacing, it's really like, how fast should you eat a meal? You should only eat a meal as fast as is comfortable and achieves the outcomes that you want. Because if you're putting too much in your mouth, in other words, if you're putting too much in your working memory, you're not going to digest it quickly enough. You're not going to make it automatic enough. You're not going to be able to, deposit it in your long-term memory and evacuate your working memory. You can then move on to the next step. So if you do it too quickly, in a way that the learner is not actually processing the information and absorbing it, then you're going to have diminishing returns, because they're not going to learn anything really. So it is all about thinking about the learner and the learning processes and arranging those, rather than attention span. Attention span is really just more meaningful in terms of the amount of information you can hold in one instant, rather than thinking about what is the optimum period of time to be learning for before you take a break, because there isn't one. It all depends on the learning you're trying to achieve and how you do it.
So that's really good. There isn't the focus then for the answer to this question should be on us concentrating on engagement rather than attention span, and flipping it from how much information can we cram in to how actively can people process this.
Yeah, I mean, not just engagement. I mean, I keep banging on about engage, build, consolidate, but that's really what you need to focus on, because that's the route to getting the most efficient learning. And that's really what we're aiming for.
All right, well, let's move on. Let's take the next question and think about another technique that we use.
Right, animation. How can the use of audio and visuals positively impact learning effectiveness? So animation is an interesting one. I think, so there's two things I think I could probably say about this. I mean, the first thing is, when it comes to human movements, we have this mirror neuron system that allows us, well, it doesn't just allow us, we have to, whether we like it or not, unconsciously, we will generate the same neural activity when we see somebody doing something, as if we are doing it ourselves. It's a way of preparing ourselves to imitate. So if you wave your hand around, then my brain is activating as if I am waving my hand around. And that's kind of helpful in terms of me understanding why you're waving your hand around, because there are also networks that activate to understand the purpose of why you're doing that. So it's not simply imitating actions, it's also preparing us to imitate the purposes and the aims and the objectives of what that other person that we're observing is trying to achieve. And that works with animation as well. So it doesn't have to be like a real person. And it's helpful for learning. And one of the things that's been demonstrated is that if you are trying to understand a process, then, seeing an animation of it and how to do a process, learn a process, seeing an animation of it can be really helpful, because it will, if it involves biological motion, in other words, if it involves somebody moving. So if you're learning how to operate a machine, seeing a cartoon of that or seeing a person do it can both be very effective. The nice thing about a cartoon, of course, is that you are removing the extraneous information, and you can focus more on the key aspects. So animation can be really helpful from that point of view, because it activates these brain networks unconsciously. It's like a type of mind reading. And even though even though that you're talking about a cartoon figure, and we've actually done this in our own brain scanners, but you're still activating your brain as if you are carrying out the motions. But I think it does help if it does look like a human being. It has been.
I think that's astonishing, isn't it? So we're actually sort of mimicking in our minds. Our brain is activating as if we're mimicking and living through the experience that we're watching from an animation, from instructions, from someone pointing or pressing a button or doing the thing. Okay. Is that active? Is that kind of helping us learn, or are we sort of passively observing that?
We're passively observing it, so you need to follow up on it. I mean, I wouldn't say that that's all you need to do, but actually, I mean, that is the basis of observational learning. And it's been shown with adults that observational learning, for example, if you're learning presentation skills, it's still a very important part of the learning experience, seeing somebody else doing it. And it's also true for emotions as well. So, because there are lots of little, we've been talking about big actions like moving your hands around. We're getting back to emotion again, I notice now. But when you have little, when you're feeling something, you have expressions, sure, but there are also micro expressions that you're not even sure, you don't even know you're producing, and somebody looking at you might not even say that you're producing, and they might not be consciously aware of it. But that will transmit the emotion. So they've shown that if you see somebody like making a sort of disgust face or something, parts of your brain activate as if you are experiencing disgust. So we are also transmitting emotions, and that's a very important message. If you're presenting in front of a camera or something, I mean, it really is important to be positive, enthusiastic, confident, and all the rest of it, because that's how the person watching us, how the observer is going to be feeling. That's how they're going to be experiencing it. So it's important from the emotional engagement point of view, but it's also important in terms of priming you to learn these things yourself as well. And you can do that through pure observation, but I think it's also good to, consolidate that through the more traditional means, discussion.
Asking questions or
all
nice.
That. Yeah.
What about the idea? I mean, that very much focuses on the visual and the biological, as you've talked about. What about this idea of hearing things simultaneous to looking at moving visuals? Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Yes. So it's been, the psychologists will tell you, some psychologists will tell you, that there's two different parts to working memory. There's like the visual working memory, and then there's like an auditory working memory. They call it visual spatial working memory and phonological loop. But essentially it's like sound and vision. And the idea is that if you've got two capacities rather than just one general working memory, then you can get more bang for your buck, if you like. You can get more working memory capacity by providing something in both the visual and the auditory. And therefore, you should always, when you show a picture, there should always be like a sound commentary, an audio commentary on top of it or whatever, because otherwise, and that's you'll be able to get more information across. Now, this is called the dual coding hypothesis, and I think we have to be really careful with it, because if you look at all the research that supports the dual coding hypothesis, and you look at other research as well, where they've shown how auditory and visual can support each other, actually, it comes back to what I've been saying before, which is it's about making the links between the two representations. That's the important thing. There is a limit to how much I wouldn't even go down the dual coding hypothesis road, really. I think it's a matter of thinking about the links between the two. And the other reason why we have to be careful about it is that actually, if you're talking about speech, so you're looking at text on a page, that's visual, isn't it? And then you're also hearing somebody talking to you at the same time. That is hopeless, because what you're hearing and what you're reading are both activating just one speech circuit. You've only got one speech circuit, and you need that speech circuit for both listening and reading. And so it's like having two voices in either ear talking at you at once, and you won't understand either of it. So when you're presenting, doing a PowerPoint presentation, that's why you need to keep your text to a minimum, because if you're talking over it at the same time. So I think the really important takeaway message is always making the links between these different forms of representation. It's great that we've got eyes, we've got ears, we've got all these senses. Use the senses, it's really great. But why are they useful? Because it allows us to represent things in so many different forms, a type of concept that we're trying to learn in different forms. And it's the making the links between those different representations that's really helpful.
Fantastic. Well, I think that answers the animation question and shows how it can have value for learning. Let's jump on. I like this one, and I'm hoping you'll enjoy it too.
I refuse to answer this question. Okay. Is neuroscience really a discipline that can meaningfully influence how we design learning experiences? Well, okay, I am a professor of neuroscience and education, so you can expect me to be biased. But let me explain. I mean, actually, I could quite happily say no. Let me deal with the no, first of all. Because if we're just talking about this bit of the brain lights up when you do this, or we're talking about the fact that there's an increase in dopamine in the brain, and we're just talking about neuroscience results. Neuroscience on its own is meaningless in terms of understanding learning. But we're not talking about neuroscience on its own. We're talking about a particular area of neuroscience, which is cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience is about making links between what's happening in the brain and and our mental processes, our cognition. And that's basically what the psychologists focus on. And psychology is a wonderful thing, but psychology is just based on behavior. It's a matter of building up these ideas about attention, memory, on what we see in terms of behavior. But there is another form of evidence in terms of what we can see, and that is the neuroscience. So it's a second form of concrete evidence. And when both the behavior and what we can see in the brain link up together, then we can be more confident about the results. So, I mean, and I think in a way, we were talking about, the dual coding hypothesis. That's not really what the neuroscience doesn't really align with that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm suspicious of it straight away. And then you look at the evidence more clearly and you think, yeah, hang on, actually, it is about making links between the representations. It's not as if we have this very clear-cut auditory working memory and this very clear-cut visual working memory. It doesn't really work like that. So I think the neuroscience is causing us to change our psychological models, and that's quite a good thing. Neuroscience really is a discipline that can helpfully influence how we design learning experiences, because I think the concepts that come from cognitive neuroscience we can be more confident in. That's my personal feeling.
Well, I'm very pleased that taking a neuroscientific look at some of the previous psychological ideas is either updating, changing, or reinforcing our thinking. So we should be looking to it. So thank you. All right. Here's one. We've kind of touched on this a little bit. Oh, no, we haven't. This is a new... Oh, I like this question. I'm going to go on. You have a read. Have a read.
If I've got them in the same order as you've got them, this is number 6. Is reading an effective strategy for learning? Does it count as active learning?
That's a good question, isn't it? I feel like the basis for this question has possibly evolved from hermeneutics and Wolfgang Iser, and the idea that meaning is realised through reading and how a reader connects and constructs the text and relates it to their own experience, which sounds like it would be, from everything you've been talking about, a very powerful tool. But it tends to be that in learning design, we sort of put writing down here and images over here, and it's not necessarily considered active. And so I wonder if it gets a bit of a bad rap. But what can you tell us about reading?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think we're talking about reading for meaning. So you're actually making meaning of the text that you're reading. Because I think all of us can speed read. I speed read a lot. And I know that that's not very helpful to my learning, because I'm just looking for one piece of information in the manual and just or the research paper, and you're just looking through it. Oh, okay, I've got that one piece of information, and the rest of what you've read has not been, processed at all, and you won't learn from it. But if we're actually learning, if we're actually reading for meaning, so we might be reading to understand particular concepts. Maybe we've been given questions that we need to answer, and we've been then provided with a text that we need to draw on to be able to answer those questions. So we're really processing the information. That can be incredibly effective. I mean, for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, it's just a load of scribbles, isn't it? So you're having to mentally imagine actually the meaning. And when we visualize ourselves rather than having just a picture of what's going on there, we are able to relate it to our own experience because we have to draw on our own experience to make it meaningful if we're visualizing it ourselves. But also when we visualize, we're activating our visual cortex almost as much as if we were actually seeing it for real in front of us. So that's been measured, and that's, very impressive. I think it just sort of suggests what an incredibly powerful thing the imagination is as a potential learning tool. And text can help promote that imagination. That's the first thing. But I think the other thing is that reading, it's in a symbolic form. Reading is a set of symbols, and it's an abstract representation. And when we are learning things in an abstract form, rather than just being shown them in a concrete way. So we could, for example, just be shown how to use a machine, or we could read some text about using that machine. Being shown is so much easier, isn't it? It's so much more accessible. And you'll learn it much more quickly and you'll grasp it much more quickly. But the problem with it is that when you transfer it to a different context, and maybe it's just the context where you're sat down with your own machine with real customers or whatever, actually it's much more difficult to transfer because you've learnt it in a single concrete context. Whereas if you've actually learnt it from symbols, i.e. could be like a diagram, but it could also be from text, from reading, then you've had to process it in an abstract form, and that's more difficult because you do have to go through this visualization thing and making meaning of it. But also, when you're doing that, you're generalizing it, you're abstracting the gist, you're abstracting the important aspects of it, and that means it's more transferable. So concrete is really easy, you can get it straight away, but it's really difficult to transfer. The abstract is more difficult to grasp, but when you grasped it, you can transfer it more easily. So educators more and more going towards this concreteness fading approach, where you start off with the concrete demonstration, but then you move to the abstract representation, and that includes text.
Could you give just a quick example of that so we can imagine this concreteness fading? Is there anything you can think of?
Yeah, so I mean, the classic thing is when you're talking about science concepts, so you could actually show how sulfuric acid, let's say, reacts with carbonate to produce carbon dioxide, turns lime water milky, whatever. But if you and you'll grasp it, and you'll be able to do exactly the same thing yourself, if with that particular type of carbonate, that particular type of acid or whatever. But if you represent it in an abstract form in terms of equations, so H plus ions reacting with carbonate ions produce carbon dioxide, it's much more difficult to grasp. But if you do grasp it, you're going to be able to transfer that to lots of different types of carbonates and acids.
Yep. Okay. Well, we tend to work in less complex areas than. No, it's a good. But I think what you're saying is, yes, reading can be an effective strategy for learning, and it's about connecting it with the visual cortex, with the imagination, and encouraging that through the words that we choose. And I think that sounds helpful because we do use a lot of words in learning. So we need to be able to use them effectively. What about the question of does it count as active then? Would you say that as long as we're building those connections, yes, reading can be as active as anything else?
Yeah, because you're processing the information. I think that's the important part of the active concept, is that you're processing the information. When you're reading, if you're reading for meaning and you're being prompted to think about the meaning that's in the text, and that's why sometimes it's not enough just to give somebody a few pages of text and say read that and then you'll understand everything. That won't work. But what can work is to say, read this, understand what the important issues are when you're approaching this concept, understand what the limitations are. In other words, you're setting them questions to ensure that they are actually extracting the meaning from the text. Then that can be really helpful.
Excellent. Right, we've got time for two more, I think. So let's hop on to the next question. And I think we've probably almost answered question 7, but I'm going to give you the opportunity to add a little bit more colour to it, if you wish.
How does an active learning experience positively impact learning effectiveness? So and what I'm saying, active is processing. There's all sorts of different ways in which that can happen. So you could be discussing, you could be drawing a diagram of it, you could be doing some enactment, so you're actually carrying out your learning in some way. You could be doing a presentation on it. All of those different things will cause you to, or you could be reading a text for me. All those different things will basically encourage you to process the information in different ways, and because you're processing the information in different ways, you're actually causing multiple representations of that thing you're trying to learn to be created in your brain. This comes back to the hat thing, where you've basically, what makes a hat useful is having lots of hats in your house, so you always can find a hat and there's more chance you're going to find the hat for the right occasion. So when you're actually approaching a context where you really want to apply your knowledge, you're going to more likely to find a form of that knowledge which is relevant to that particular situation, and also that knowledge is going to be more accessible because it's networked with all this other stuff that's in your brain as a result of actively processing it in so many different forms.
And for us, I suppose, effectiveness is all about, yes, it's being represented in the brain, but of course, our role is to help people apply that learning in their work context, and get better and better at what they're performing in their jobs. And so is there a relationship between the quality of that experience of active processing and their ability to apply things, I say back in the real world, but, we sort of imagine that a learning intervention happens and then activities take place in the real world. Is there a connection there? Will they be more likely to apply something if they've had a more active experience? And by conversely, would they be less likely to apply something if they've had a more passive learning experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And psychologists talk about levels of processing. And the more deeply you process something, in other words, the more you represent it in all these different ways and forms, then the more accessible that information is going to be to apply it when you really need it in the real world, if you like. Yeah.
Love active learning, love effectiveness. We've got one more question left, and
this is a really difficult one, is it? It's to the end.
You'll be the judge.
Oh, okay. What can the neuroscience tell us about the benefits of social learning? Okay. You have to be careful how you're defining social learning here, but if we're talking about learning with other people, because some scientists would define social learning as just observational learning, but I think here you're talking about it in terms of there being some sort of discourse between yourself and somebody else.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And I think, first of all, that discourse is going to be causing you to represent things in different ways. So that's going to be causing you to process the information. because you're having to build a bridge between your understanding and somebody else's. And actually, that can be a very creative process. So, you're probably generating new ways of looking at the idea because you're not going to have the same impression as the other person. So that building of bridges and that generating of new ideas and the sharing of different perspectives is going to really help make the information more accessible and usable and permanent as well. So that's the first thing. But the other thing is, of course, it really helps you engage in the first place because we're primates, we're social beings, and actually more than primates, we are the type of primate that has higher oxytocin levels. And the significance of that means that we pay much more attention to our in-group and we're more able to share attention towards a common aim. I know that chimpanzees are actually closest to us genetically, but they're not very good collaborators. We're much more like tamarins and marmosets who also share parenting, which is, I think this is the basis of how this evolved, our ability to share attention, and the fact that when we share attention, our reward system activates. So one of the reasons why watching sport is so much fun with other people is because everybody is sharing attention to where the ball is and what's going on the pitch. And because or whatever sport it is, and because you're sharing that attention, it makes it so much easier to engage. That's what makes it engaging. But it's also a really important platform for learning, and it kicks in at an early age when you're an infant and your mum or your dad is looking at something, you will get a dopamine response because you are looking at it as well, because we are that sort of primate. And therefore, if you're sharing attention, all has to happen is that your mum or dad starts using a word and you start associating that word with that object, and then you have the basis of language forming. So it's a really important platform for human learning. And that's why we do enjoy learning together so much. That it's a really important part of it. It's really difficult to learn on your own, and I think especially these days, we've got a lot of people who are trying to do it at the moment.
What about this idea that we've maybe touched on before around instigating sharing and being the author of the question? Does that have any power?
Yeah, so the research shows that there's more reward system response when you initiate the shared attention, or sometimes it's called joint attention. It's the same thing, really. When you initiate it, so basically attracting attention to yourself is very rewarding experience, and that's why you need to have a conversation. And it's not good enough for social learning to, you wouldn't call it social learning really just to be in a lecture theatre with having somebody talking at you, or watching a video online where somebody's just talking at you. I mean, you could say, but there's two people involved. It's a sort of a discourse, isn't it? But it's not really social because it's not turn taking. And it's the turn taking which is the most rewarding. It's because it, particularly when you initiate the shared attention and you say, oh, but what about this? Or can I show you this? Or I think this. That is the rewarding part of the discourse.
So in our learning designs, then, we can be thinking about opportunities to ask learners or participants to think of their own questions that they would ask other people about a topic, or think of a question you might ask an expert, or encouraging that initiation, did you say? Not instigation like I used. Initiation.
Yeah, it's the initiation of the shared attention, which can happen several times during a conversation, can't it?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like that's an important part, and I think we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much for sharing all of these answers and sharing your attention with me today. And we will speak again next time. Thanks so much, Paul.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Kate.